Look at this photograph. This was taken in 1893 in Chicago, Illinois. What you're seeing is a city that looks like it was carved out of ancient Rome. Giant columns, white marble walls, massive domes, grand fountains. Over 27 million people visited this place in just 6 months. That's more than the entire population of the United States at the time visiting one location. They called it the White City. And every single person who walked through those gates believed they were looking at real stone, real marble, real history. They were wrong. And the men who eventually tore it all down, they were the ones who discovered the truth. Today, we're going to talk about what those demolition workers found, what that material really was, why the whole thing was built to be destroyed, and why this story has been quietly sitting in history books for over 130 years without anyone really talking about it the right way. First, let's set the scene, because the scale of this thing is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. It was officially called the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. It was held in Chicago's Jackson Park, and it covered 690 acres of land. For reference, that's bigger than most small American towns today. The whole thing was built to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus arriving in the Americas. But really, it was America saying to the entire world, "Look how powerful we are." And Chicago had something to prove. Just 22 years earlier, in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire had wiped out a massive portion of the city. Chicago rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible, and the 1893 World's Fair was their ultimate flex to the world. Now here's where it gets interesting. The man put in charge of building this entire city, all 200 buildings, miles of roads, canals, lagoons, electric lights, the first Ferris wheel ever built, was an architect named Daniel Burnham. And Burnham had one massive problem. He had to build an entire city that looked like it had existed for centuries in less than 2 years. No bulldozers, no cranes, no concrete mixers, no trucks, just horses, hand tools, and thousands of immigrant workers. The question was, how do you build something that looks like the Roman Colosseum in under 24 months when you have basically nothing? The answer to that question is the whole story. Here's what almost nobody talks about. The buildings weren't made of marble. They weren't made of stone. They weren't even made of real cement in the way we think of it today. They were made of something called staff. Now, what is staff? Staff was a building material invented in France around 1876. It was first used at the Paris Exposition of 1878. America essentially borrowed the idea, and the 1893 Chicago World's Fair brought it to American soil on a scale nobody had ever attempted before. The recipe for staff was actually documented by the engineers who built the fair. According to the assistant engineer of the World's Columbian Exposition himself, a man named Joseph Kendall Freitag, who wrote about this in Engineering magazine back in 1891, here's what staff was made of: plaster of Paris, which is powdered gypsum, mixed with cement, mixed with glycerin and dextrin, which are binding agents, and then reinforced with hemp fiber, jute fiber, or coarse cloth woven right into the casting to give it strength. You'd mix all of this with water until it was approximately the consistency of thick molasses. Then you'd pour it into molds shaped like columns, like carved stone blocks, like marble archways, and in about half an hour it would harden. And here's the wild part. Once it hardened, you could saw it, nail it, bend it. It was lightweight, it was fast, and when you painted it white, it looked exactly like carved marble. The facades of the buildings were these shell-like staff panels, about half an inch thick, nailed directly onto wooden frames. Some of the larger buildings used iron and steel frames, but most of the construction underneath was almost entirely wood. An 1891 article in the Pittsburgh Dispatch, written before the fair even opened, actually called out this deception directly. The writer said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "These buildings will look like they were made of real stone, built to last for ages, but almost every one of them will be built of wood." The critic called it, quote, "a counterfeit and a sham." And yet, when it opened, nobody could tell the difference. 27 million people walked through and thought they were seeing ancient marble palaces. The illusion was perfect. Now let's talk about the people who actually built this thing, because they don't get enough credit. The fair was constructed mostly by immigrant laborers, thousands of them, Italians, Poles, Germans, Irish, men who'd come to America with nothing and built one of the most spectacular temporary cities in human history. One historical image from the time, a drawing called Going Home from Work from Scribner's Magazine, 1892, shows dozens of these workers streaming out of the fairgrounds after a shift. They were paid very little. They worked in brutal conditions, and most of them never knew their names would be connected to something that would be studied for over a century. The construction timeline was almost insane. They had to build 200 structures, including the largest building in the world at that time, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, which was so big it had an entire indoor cycling track inside it. Everything had to be done using horses, hand tools, and human labor. No power equipment, no cranes, no modern concrete mixers, and every single one of those grand-looking facades nailed on, panel by panel, by hand. One engineer noted that the staff production facility was set up right on the fairgrounds in Jackson Park. Workers would mix the ingredients on site, pour them into clay molds, wait 30 minutes, pop them out, and start nailing them to whatever was being built that day. It was essentially an industrial illusion factory running at full speed for 2 years straight. The fair officially opened on May 1st, 1893, and the reaction was unlike anything the country had seen before. Visitors who arrived by train from across the country would step off and see this glowing white skyline for the first time, and they genuinely could not believe it was real. The buildings were lit at night by over 90,000 electric lights, which was extraordinary for 1893. Most Americans had never seen electric lights in person. The combination of the white facades and the electric illumination made the whole place look like it was glowing from within. Architecture critics were divided. Some were in awe, others saw right through it. The famous architect Louis Sullivan, who was actually a contemporary of Daniel Burnham, was furious. He later wrote in 1922 that the classical, fake marble style of the White City had set back American architecture by 40 years. He felt that America had chosen theatrical illusion over genuine artistic development. But the public didn't care. They saw something magical. They saw the future, or at least what the future could look like. The fair ran until October 30th, 1893. Over that 6-month period, 27.5 million people attended. The last day was supposed to include a massive closing ceremony, but it was canceled after the beloved Chicago mayor, Carter Harrison Sr., was assassinated just days before. The fair ended quietly, bittersweet, and then came the question: what do you do with a fake marble city when the party is over? This is where the story gets really fascinating. Within weeks of the fair closing, demolition began. The South Park Commission had always planned to return the land to parkland. Jackson Park exists today because of that decision. The demolition crews came in, and when they started swinging hammers and prying off panels, what they found genuinely shocked some of the workers who hadn't been part of the original construction. Because from the outside, these buildings looked like solid marble Roman temples, but when you hit the wall, nothing. Half an inch of painted plaster, and then wood. One historical account from the period described observers watching the ruins and being unable to believe the buildings weren't ancient stone palaces. The disconnect between what it looked like and what it was struck everyone who witnessed the demolition. Some workers reportedly couldn't believe they were tearing down something so grand and that it came apart so easily. And then nature finished the job. On January 8, 1894, just months after the fair closed, a massive fire broke out. The blaze started in the casino, tore through the peristyle, consumed the music hall, and spread into the massive manufactures building. The Chicago Tribune the next day reported that 20,000 spectators watched the east end of the Court of Honor vanish in smoke and flame. Men of mature years stood in the crowd, grieved and silent. Women wept. The Colombian guards, who had patrolled the fair for 6 months, were described as watching the landmarks crumble as if losing a dear friend. What did those buildings look like when they burned? Charred timbers and blackened plaster. That's the line from the original Chicago Tribune report. Not stone, not marble, charred wood and blackened plaster. The truth was visible for anyone to see in the ruins. A second fire in July 1894 finished off most of what remained. The White City, all 690 acres of it, was essentially gone in less than a year after it closed. Only a handful of structures survived. The Palace of Fine Arts, the one building actually designed to be permanent, still stands today. It became the Field Museum and later the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. If you visit Chicago, you can walk into a building that was part of the 1893 World's Fair. The Norway Building, a traditional wooden stave church, was relocated to Wisconsin, and then in 2015, descendants of the original Norwegian workers who built it dismantled it again and shipped it back to Norway. It now stands in Orkdal, Norway, restored and reassembled. The main State Building was relocated to Poland Spring, Maine, where it still stands today, and the Dutch House was moved to Brookline, Massachusetts. 4 structures out of over 200. And here's what I want you to sit with for a second. The buildings that looked the most permanent, the grand neoclassical marble palaces of the Court of Honor, lasted less than a year after the fair. The buildings that were more honest about what they were, wood, real materials, built for actual use, those are the ones that survived 130 years. There's something almost poetic about that. So why does this matter? Here's what I keep coming back to. In 1893, before electricity was widespread, before cars, before any modern construction equipment, America built an entire city in under 2 years, fooled 27 million people into thinking it was marble, and then erased almost all of it within 12 months. The workers who built it knew what it was made of. The engineers who designed it knew. The architects debated it publicly before it even opened. But the public, the millions of ordinary Americans who came from across the country on trains they'd saved up for, who stood at the gates of Jackson Park and looked up at those gleaming white columns, they had no idea. And here's the question that nobody in 1893 asked out loud, but that I think is worth asking now. Is there anything wrong with a beautiful lie if the lie makes people feel something real? Those 27 million visitors left Chicago changed. They went home with stories, with wonder, with a sense that America could build something magnificent. The buildings weren't real marble, but the feeling those buildings created, that was entirely real. The last demolition worker to swing a hammer at the White City, he didn't just tear down plaster and wood, he tore down a dream. And maybe that's why nobody talks about it that way. All right, here's what I want to know from you. If you had been one of those 27 million people who visited the White City in 1893, and you found out after you left that every single thing you thought was marble was actually plaster and wood, would you feel cheated, or would it not matter? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know, because I think people's answers to that question say a lot about how we think about art, history, and what it means for something to be real. And if you want to go deeper on this story, because there's a lot more, including the serial killer who operated a hotel right next to the fair during those same 6 months, that video is right here. Hit subscribe if you're new. I cover the hidden corners of American history that textbooks skip over. I'll see you in the next one.